Hi, we're the Mind-Body Couple.
I'm Tanner Murtagh.
And I'm Ann Hampson.
And this podcast is dedicated to helping you unlearn neuroplastic pain and mind-body concerns. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, everybody.
We had a busy weekend.
Yeah, we did. It was our daughter's 4th birthday party full of 4-year-old kids.
There was a lot of kids running around our house.
Yeah.
For any parents out there, birthdays, they're exhausting.
Oh, yeah. It's a full day affair. I think I started preparing and cleaning the house literally at 7 a.m. by myself. Tanner was doing some work, to be fair.
Yeah, come on now. You always make me sound so bad on this podcast.
I feel like I have to a little bit. Just
getting you shots
get people on my side a little.
Publicly, just shaming me. It's hurtful.
Yeah.
I worked all morning, and then I took our son to gymnastics.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I was doing things.
I guess. Anyways, yeah. But it was stressful and tiring.
We had a Frozen Elsa birthday.
Yeah, and we actually had an Elsa, impersonator. Actress come. And it was great, actually. The kids seemed to really love it.
Yeah. She told the Frozen story.
Yes.
She even broke out into song.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was pretty good.
So think of that ventral vagal energy. All those kids were really in there.
Those kids were
just happy, just feeling good, excited. Maybe some sympathetic energy as well.
Yeah, a little too excited.
Yeah.
Our son got a little rowdy,
Yeah.
He's dressed, if anyone hasn't watched Frozen, they're going to be like, what are you talking about?
Right, that's right.
He dressed up as Olaf.
Yes.
And got him like an Olaf. It's like a snowman. It was hilarious. Yeah, it was great.
He looked pretty good. Anyway, so that was our weekend full of energy and excitement, and now we're pretty tired.
And today, we've been doing this podcast for over a year.
I know, which is crazy. I feel like time really flies.
And I thought we would discuss a bit more about our story, because we probably have some new listeners.
Yeah, we think and we know at the beginning of this podcast, we really kind of talked about our story. We kind of wanted to revisit it because there's so much in there that we hope can provide some inspiration and hope in terms of healing and recovery.
Yeah. And so what we're going to talk about is the darkest moments of chronic pain to the brightest moments of healing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thought a lot about that title.
Nice
it's pretty
title,
good, right?
Tanner. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about my story. I always explain with my story. I give a disclaimer around suicidality. I'm just careful because that is part of my story. I'm going to discuss it a bit. So if that's something that triggers you, there's no need for you to listen to this podcast, of course.
Yes.
And if people are having those thoughts, make sure, you call a crisis line in your area, go to a hospital emergency room. Just want to state that very clearly.
Yeah, for sure.
And so for myself, when we talk about my chronic pain, it was progressive. And like a lot of people, it was very progressive in my symptoms expanding more and more. And when we talk about neuroplastic pain and symptoms, this is how they behave. They start to spread over time.
Yeah.
And so at first it was my right knee when I was running lots, training for my first triathlon. And then it was my left knee. And then my shoulders started to hurt. And eventually over time, it was so widespread. It was my back, my hips, even pelvic pain a little bit, headaches.
When you say over time, Tanner, what is this over time, a couple of years for you?
Yeah, it probably took a couple of years for it to be so widespread. And I always think about this, I always mess up the times, but I think I was having chronic pain for about 3.5 years, something in that range. And so after about 2 years, it was pretty intense, widespread. And like a lot of people, I did every medical treatment imaginable. Got all the tests, scans, everything was getting done. And nothing worked. nothing actually got better.
Do you remember that kind of roller coaster of hope you might have been on with like each new treatment or?
Yeah, and I think that's such a trap that we fall into when it's neuroplastic, and I get it. But we look for what's the next physical treatment? What's the next physical treatment? Trying to figure this out, just that desperation. And yeah, having hope and then falling dark into despair because nothing was actually working.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of people talk to me about that roller coaster, which makes sense. But then it makes sense of like, okay, I don't want to believe that something can work. Or when people come to this, mind-body approach, very skeptical of this as well, as almost like protecting themselves.
Yes. Yeah, and I get it. It's a different approach. And maybe you're listening to this podcast and you're just starting to dip your toe into some of this. And the research is there now. We know this approach is effective in treating chronic pain and symptoms.
Yeah.
And we've seen that with the clients we work with, and I've seen that with myself. And it took a lot. Like I'm a therapist. You think I'd be more open to this kind of thing, but I was very skeptical, and we'll get to that in a moment. But some of the darkest moments, because there are some dark moments when we have chronic pain and symptoms.
Yeah.
And one of the darkest, and you probably remember this quite clearly, Anne, is we went with your parents to Houston, and this was close to the end of my journey. This was probably, I don't know.
Like the third year, the final
year.
it
was like the final year. And I remember being just terrified to go on this trip.
What were you terrified of?
Well, I was so unable to move. And that's what really scared me, is I really didn't have the ability to move much without my pain increasing rapidly. And I had all sorts of reasons I thought that was the case. Now I know it was my brain and nervous system being stuck in a state of survival, but at the time I thought my body was just falling apart. And I remember one of the lowest points I had is we were in Houston and I had to use like a wheelchair.
Yeah, and I think this was kind of the only time you had to use a wheelchair, really.
Yeah, because at home I could limit it.
Yes.
Basically, it wasn't useful. We're not going to heal by avoiding. That's definitely something I want to get across to people, but at home I would just avoid everything as much as possible.
Right. So this trip was like, there's no way of avoiding. You needed a wheelchair for assistance.
Yeah. And we talk about that low, like, dorsal vagal kind of shutdown, despair, hopeless, helpless. That's where I was landing. And so, when I think back on that trip to Houston, like, I was dysregulated. Like, it was...
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember much of that trip, but it was definitely a dark moment in the journey.
I do remember that trip. I think it was definitely dark. I kind of didn't know what to do at that point. Like, I feel like I had been trying to kind of support you in your pain journey for a long time, and your mental health journey for a long time. And so I didn't really know kind of what was happening. It wasn't a surprise to me that you needed a wheelchair in the way, like, everything was progressing.
Yeah.
But I feel like at that point, like, it was just kind of like one thing after another in terms of how this was rolling. And so it wasn't surprising, but it was also like, man, like, how did we get here kind of thing.
I know. And it was one of those moments where I had that same thought, like, how did I get to this place? Like, what is going on compared to 3 years prior, training for a triathlon, working, going to school, like, really having this busy, full life, an intense life. Partly there was some issues going on that triggered all this, but it really started to sink at this point.
And I remember, like, it's wondering, how did it get here? Like, this is kind of like odd in the situation that we're finding ourselves in, but also it was normal because, like, I was getting used to kind of things just kind of going downhill too. So it was a mix of like, oh my gosh, to like, oh yeah, well, of course, at the same time.
Yeah. And even when we got back from Houston, around this time, like, I stopped working.
Yes. Yeah.
And when we talk about the darkest moments, at the time we lived kind of in a split level with our friends above us, kind of on like the bottom, like, basement suite. And for months, like after I stopped working, I was just shut down.
Yeah.
I would stay inside. I was so dissociative at this point that I wouldn't even know if you were home or not half the time.
No, and I think we've talked about this before in other podcasts. Like, this was the point where, like, our relationship struggled the most. We were very disconnected. I was finishing grad school, and so I was also kind of in survival mode of, like, I just must finish this.
Yeah.
And so, like, I was aware that you were struggling and all of that, but I really had to put my focus on that. I was, like, in my final semester. But that was very stressful.
It was. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, we were planning on getting married.
That's right. Also, we were planning our wedding. That was going to happen that summer. So, yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, we were engaged, and it was a pretty dark time looking back.
Yeah, it was. Actually, in a lot of things, it was a dark time leading up to the wedding. I remember feeling like this is not normal leading up to a wedding. You know? It was, Yeah,
and at Christmas time, this was kind of the lowest moment. Like at Christmas that year.
Yeah.
I remember, like, we go to my parents as we usually do.
Yeah.
And, you know, I came home and I was in such pain. And there's something about Christmas time, because we celebrate Christmas, where it just felt, you know, such a disconnect from, like, the hopefulness of the season.
Yeah, which is, like, for some context, Tanner and I love the holiday season. And so to feel this disconnect from, like, the hope and the joy really speaks to kind of where you're at.
Yeah, and around this period is when in my journey, I had a lot of suicidal thoughts. And we talk about chronic pain and symptoms. Not everyone has them, but for a lot of people, it makes sense why we get there.
Of course, yeah.
Because we feel like this hopeless feeling, like there's nothing we can do. We feel helpless, especially when you're interacting with the medical system. You get the treatment, but outside of that, there's not much you can do.
Well, that's right. It's like so many people say, hey, the medical doctors are saying this, but there's no solution really.
Yeah. And so that Christmas time was truly probably one of the darkest moments in my healing journey. Just paired with such suicidality taking place.
Well, and I remember for me, and so I was finishing school, I was doing like a practicum, which for some people it's like an internship. It was a therapy internship elsewhere at an organization. And I remember, like, because you weren't working, and I was kind of nervous, like whenever I got texts from you or didn't get texts from you, I would be nervous to go home of like, is Tanner okay? Yeah. And so there was a lot, like, of that stress. And I know probably some loved ones that are listening might relate to that too.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It took a toll on our relationship. And is incredibly difficult on both sides.
Yes.
I think it's important to know that. It's difficult on both sides of the person with the pain or symptoms and the partner or the loved one or parent or caregiver trying to support them, also feeling hopeless and helpless in this kind of approach.
Well, and I think often like the loved ones or caregivers go into this like survival mode as well as like protection or caregiving or just kind of like, I must be on top of everything or something like that.
Yeah, everyone involved is basically in survival mode.
Yes, yep.
In a state of survival in their nervous system. And, you know, the big shift that happened, this was soon after the holiday season.
Yes.
I was on YouTube like late one night because at night my back and hips would just hurt a lot. And so I was like up late. Found some random YouTube video of some guy saying he read Dr. Sarno's book and he healed. And at first I thought it was a little scammy. I was like, there's something weird going on here. Like, this sounds too good to be true.
Which makes sense.
Yeah,
like,
it was.
You come across things like that or things like us and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and I was looking around. There was a few websites at the time. There's so much more now that people have on the ability to kind of heal, but I was pretty limited on some YouTube videos. Eventually I bought Dr. Sarno's book, and I was really skeptical the first couple months. Like, I would read a bit and then stop.
Why would you stop? Why would you read a bit and stop?
Because I didn't want to get my hopes up.
Oh, so it was that same,
it
like,
really
roller
was.
coaster
Like, I was like,
protection.
I don't want to get my hopes up about this. And I didn't believe that that's actually what was taking place fully yet.
What made you go back to it then to keep reading?
Because there was nothing else I could do.
Okay. It was the only thing.
It was the only thing, and there was something to it that I started to look for some of that evidence that it's neuroplastic, and that's the second episode we ever did, was all the evidence you need to look for.
Yeah.
That it's neuroplastic pain or symptoms, and I started to understand that.
Yeah.
And around a month before our wedding, with me putting it right down to the line, like, I remember I went on my bachelor party weekend. I had this moment where I started using the techniques at one point when my back was really bad. Was this your
first time using the techniques?
Like, full-heartedly, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
I talked to my friend, and he was like, you got to do this. Like, you just need to, like, commit and see what happens. So I got, like, that final push where I was like, okay, I got to do this. And at the time, like, we went to the hot springs, and my back was just killing me. Like, it was hard to walk. Went and lied in this bed, started to do some of the emotional processing, giving messages of safety, and all of a sudden the pain, like, in my back, like, dissipated, like, almost completely.
What was it like for you to notice that, like, almost for the first time?
It was wild. I was like, what is happening? And from that point, I was like, there's something here that I need to get figured out.
So that helped you buy in.
It did.
Yeah. One thing I want to highlight to those of you listening that do the techniques and don't notice this rapid shift in pain like Tanner's describing, it doesn't mean that that's not going to happen or it might not happen down the road. Everybody is different.
Yeah. And my pain came back. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't it wasn't a one-shot deal and just done. And like it did come back a few days later, but I had enough hope at that point. There was a little bit of brightness where I was like, I gotta do this. So I remember when I came back from my bachelor party weekend, I was like, I'm committed. Like, I'm doing this no matter what. And I started using, like, all the techniques. And it's weird because I can be a pretty intense guy, but it wasn't intense like I'm trying to make my pain go away. I was just, like, genuinely interested in, like, cultivating safety and using these techniques and really practicing them. Like, there was no deadline I ever set. Like, a lot of people set a deadline, and that's what gets them in trouble.
Well, I think it's important that you're highlighting that, Tanner, because if we're doing it with this pressure, which I know is hard not to do, but that keeps that kind of fight and flight activated.
It does. And there was one of the few moments in my life, there wasn't much pressure as I was using the techniques. Like,
interesting. Like, even our wedding wasn't pressure for you, Tanner. Not that I'm upset about that, but I feel like it should have been.
Yeah. But there was no pressure. I was like,
no pressure for him.
Like, I cultivated the right attitude, and I really accredit that to healing. I was light, I was easy, playful. And this was about a month before our wedding when I committed to doing this. And I remember one of the bright moments was at our wedding, which I was also scared for because weddings, you stand around all day.
Yes. You have to, like, look and be happy.
Yeah, you gotta, and I really did a lot of work for that day. And it was a bright moment, not because there wasn't pain, because there was some pain for sure. Like, I was a month in. But I was able to do things that I wouldn't have been usually.
Yeah, like, I actually remember you dancing
a
lot. Like, we got a band, and I was like, oh my God, we must dance a lot as the wedding party, in a weird way to please the band. But it was a lot of fun.
The band was fun. And that was the bright moment. There was, like, this dancing that I was able to do.
Yeah.
With you, with my friends.
Yeah.
Like, it was this moment that really supported my healing because it was one of those, like, healing wins that really stuck in my mind.
Yeah.
That I was able to do that. And I still, took breaks as I went. Like, when we did photos, and I hate photos. I know Anne doesn't.
Our
like
photos
this.
were like half an hour, Tanner.
I know, it's because
Let me be clear that they were not really wedding photos here.
I told Anne, I was like, you have half an hour. And I talked to the photographer who's a family friend, and I was like, you got half an hour. That's all I'm doing. And I set a boundary. Proud of myself for that.
Oh my God.
But I was able to do it. Like,
Yeah.
even standing for half an hour was a month earlier not possible.
Well, and I think something that you're highlighting here, Tanner, is like you started to prove to yourself and see, hey, I can do things that I didn't think I could. And you keep mentioning that you made this commitment to try this out. And I think sometimes people make, a little bit of commitment, but almost maybe not enough. And so there's something about like, okay, I'm going to be super open to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a definite decision that I was going to do this and commit.
And believe in it, I think is important.
It was, yeah. And that belief grew over time.
Yeah.
But even for our relationship, I remember this moment, and this was probably maybe a few months after our wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And so my pain had reduced like greatly.
Mm-hmm.
Like it really wasn't chronic after about 4 months. So it was sometime in there. I had this moment where we were like being very playful. We were joking around with our cats. There was like a tickle fight going on. And it was this moment where like all of a sudden I felt very connected compared to when I was in pain and so dissociative.
Yes.
And there was such a great shift there.
Yeah.
That I realized like our relationship was healing as well.
Yes.
As we went about this. It wasn't just my brain and nervous system that was healing. Like we were healing together.
Yeah.
In a certain way.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember like obviously starting to feel that shift as well as we just started to become more connected. I'm seeing you healing and like knowing your pain was decreasing or knowing that, you felt like you had found something that was working for you was really helpful too. Yeah. But yeah, like I remember when you were dissociative, we never really, there was no connection, no conversation. Like it was really odd. And so it started to feel like we were having a relationship again. And that was a big change for me too.
Yeah. Now let's fast forward a little bit longer.
Sure.
I'm doing my healing wins in order.
Okay.
Chronologically.
Mm-hmm. Another
huge one that I did a lot of work, I want to be clear with people on, is like the exposure work to movement. Mm-hmm. Like I did that early on.
And what did that work that you did look like?
Consistent somatic tracking, somatic practices, while pushing the line and doing a little bit more.
And it's not, and just to be clear to people, it's not about the absence of pain.
No, like I had pain, and if it got too high, I would back off a bit.
Yep.
But I was trying to teach my brain and nervous system, hey, you can use your body again. Because that was one thing that I knew I needed to tackle early on to actually heal.
Yes. And so to be clear, Tanner's pain was dissipating, but it took time. It took continued exposure. And again, that exposure isn't always without pain. It's that corrective experience.
Yes. And we have lots of episodes on condition responses, exposure, but that was a huge part of my journey. Now, on another bachelor party, my friend's bachelor party, we went out to British Columbia, and we were going to go for a walk. It was just a group of guys, and we were kind of in this like remote area. We're going to go for a walk, and they all started to run, and it was getting dark. Like it was probably not safe. It was pretty dark out, and we were like running through the forest. And we probably ran for like 25 minutes. Just joking around, jumping all over the place. And this was about a year after I started using this approach. And it was remarkable because I was terrified to barely walk. And all of a sudden I was able to run. Like I wasn't worried about it. I didn't have pain. And it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, my body actually is okay.
Do you think, Tanner, that is a result of that corrective exposure to movement of like, okay, I'm going to challenge myself a little bit more and then a little bit more and then increase it a little bit more?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like it definitely was the result of doing that. And I remember even all my friends were pretty shocked. Like they thought
they're like, Tanner's running.
Even after a year, they thought, okay, Tanner's not going to do this. But I was fine, and I did it, and it was.
Did any pain happen in that run at all?
No, like there was some soreness, like the day after, but it wasn't pain.
It was just typical soreness.
Yeah, because I typically had I tackled, at this point I was working out at the gym and doing lots of things, but running was one that I really feared. And I had done some of it, but in a very controlled, like treadmill kind of way, where this was so many jagged movements, jumping over branches. Like it was so spontaneous, and I realized like, I can spontaneously use my body and not have to like overthink this anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really shocked me. Yeah.
It even like, as I hear Tanner tell this, like you could see how like amazed you were right now, even remembering it.
It was quite a remarkable moment, and that's part of why we've made this podcast is we want people to have those healing wins.
Yes. Well, and I think a big reason for today's episode, Tanner, is like we know how helpful it is to have those stories of hope and those stories of healing. And I know so many people lean into them. And so we're hoping this episode again could be that for people in terms of like, okay, it can work. It can get better.
Yeah. Now, last healing success we're going to talk about. And this was actually recently. This was last weekend. We've jumped forward.
Okay.
Last weekend after I brought my son to gymnastics.
Good work.
He's obsessed with this one Taylor Swift song called 22.
Okay.
So every time we get in the car, he's like, put on my favorite song.
Really? I didn't know that.
We listen to it. It's a good song. I like Taylor Swift. But I've listened to that song a lot. But it was one of these moments where we put it on. He does this like dancing in his car seat. We're singing. And it was just a spectacular moment that I never thought was going to be possible. And I think it's really important to like savor those. And it's not always about the pain reducing, and not all these bright moments I'm talking about were about pain reducing. There were other things taking place, like our relationship improving. But one thing I was terrified when I was in pain is I'm not going to be able to have kids.
Yes. And I actually remember this. And I remember you saying that. Like, I remember actually when we were like about to get married or before, and we were talking about kids, Tanner, and you were like, well, one, you didn't know like what your future was going to look like in so many ways, but also you didn't know if you were able to have that in your life as well, in terms of like be able to kind of manage the demands and everything that might take. So I think that was valid for you. Yeah,
there were so many fears because I was so immobilized mentally and physically that it seemed so far off. And so those moments with our kids are really remarkable, and big healing moments. And so, in this, like, I really wanted to talk about, the darkest moments that we have with chronic pain and symptoms, but give hope that you can have these right moments. You can work towards that. And your healing may not look like mine.
No.
It probably won't. It's going to look different. Your brain and nervous system is different. But you can find ways to actually have these symptoms decrease or become eliminated when they're neuroplastic. It just takes some commitment and some consistency to this approach.
And I like that, like, as you went through your journey, Tanner, you really noticed the changes as you went along. And that's important, of like noticing, okay, what are your specific changes? What kind of progress are you seeing that's different for you?
Exactly. So people should reflect on that. What are your healing wins? And it doesn't need to be your pain or symptom reducing. It can be lots of things that have improved since you've started this. Or if you're new to starting this journey, start to collect those healing wins early on.
Totally.
Because they gave me hope, they gave me motivation to keep going.
And if any like loved ones are listening to this podcast, or if you're wanting your loved ones involved in your journey, this is something that's really useful for them too. And it's not always about the person that's recovering or the person in pain. It's about like their changes that they're noticing as the journey progresses too, or their own journey too of the loved one.
Exactly. So we appreciate everyone listening to this episode, and we will talk to you all next week.
Talk to you next week. Thanks for listening. If you want to book in a session with one of our therapists, you can go to our website at painpsychotherapy.ca.
You can also follow us on Instagram at Pain Psychotherapy. where me and Anne are posting content daily and are there to respond to your comments. Also, check out our YouTube channel, which is named Tanner Murtagh, MSW, RSW.